Stay tuned at BlizzCon. We're talking to Ion Hazzikostas, the lead encounter designer on World of Warcraft, which I guess means you're the guy primarily in charge of all the dungeons and raids and stuff, and the guys we kill there.
Yes, my team makes our awesome dungeon and raid bosses.
Before we get to that, I want to get into the expansion as a whole, because we're going back in time here, going back to the Orc origin almost. So tell us why are we going into that period and why are we doing it now?
So ultimately, there's this really rich background of lore, and for many players that joined the franchise and their first exposure to Warcraft was with World of Warcraft, they may not have actually gotten to experience these stories firsthand. They've seen sort of the legacy and the aftermath of many of these characters and their actions, but there's a lot of material here in a world that's rich and full of adventure and danger that we'd love to revisit and love to explore, and Warlords of Draenor is our chance to do that. Here we're really taking a look back at the roots of Warcraft, at the roots of the Orcs, at the roots of the Horde, and familiar characters such as Gul'dan and Ner'zhul, who later went on to become the Lich King, and Grommash Hellscream, father of Garrosh, and many more who live and fight and occupy this savage world that players now get to visit.
I know. I got to play a bit of the demo earlier, and one of the guys you meet really early on is Durotan, Thrall's father, and yes, the guy that Durotar is named after.
Yes, exactly. And many of these connections, I think it adds depth to the stories of familiar existing characters. Horde players certainly will be accompanied by Thrall in their adventures as they get to work with the Frostwolf Orcs, help them fend off the Iron Horde and resist the advances of the Iron Horde, but they also will get to gain some insight into who Thrall is, where Thrall has come from. Similarly, on the Alliance side, this is actually a wonderful chance for us to really explore some of the interesting aspects of the Draenei and their civilization. Really get to see the height of Draenei civilization and its glory. In Outland, many of their landmarks, many of their buildings had fallen into ruin after the events that tore apart Draenor and turned it into Outland. What was then Black Temple now actually still stands as the Holy Temple of Karabor. And the smoldering crater back in Terakar Forest that was Aukendun is again now the mausoleum of the Draenei spirits. And you can see massive Draenei cities, and they really are this proud and noble race that until you arrive are the only thing that's holding back the tide of the Iron Horde from just sweeping across Draenor.
Yeah, let's talk about the Iron Horde, because what's actually going on since we're traveling back in time and meeting old orcs?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, we really see this isn't a time travel expansion so much as it's just using time travel as a vehicle to get us to this world, to get us to this setting. The threat that we face is very much a real and present one. It's that the Iron Horde armies are going to march through the Dark Portal into our world and lay waste to everything. Eastern Kingdoms, Kalimdor, Horde, Alliance, everyone will be destroyed if we don't stop them. And it's up to you initially, at the outset of Warlords of Draenor, to go through that Dark Portal behind enemy lines and sort of initially sabotage their portal and sabotage their plans, though that is just a small victory. And the rest of your story arc is really one about winning the war, about building up an army, building your garrison, recruiting followers, breaking apart the alliances that are forming within the Iron Horde, and really working to take every part of that machinery down so that you can actually ultimately win.
Right. Draenor will be sort of familiar to a lot of people because it's the same place that the Burning Crusade takes place in, only Burning Crusade is much further on their story, and the world has been halfway destroyed by then. So what sort of familiarity and differences can we expect when we travel through that new world?
Right. So Draenor, unlike what we did with Cataclysm, where we sort of made modifications to our existing zones, Draenor is really created completely from scratch, from the ground up, but it's done so in ways to be intentionally evocative of certain areas that have direct parallels in Outland. So, for example, Nagrand was always the place in Outland that was most unspoiled, and so you'll see it preserved in a largely familiar state here. In other places, the Gorgrond, which is this sort of mountainous, hilly area with steam vents coming out of the ground. That and Frostfire Ridge, for example, together combined when pressed together by this massive release of energy to form the Blade's Edge Mountains. In general, so there are direct parallels between the structure of the continents and the layout of the zones, but these are newly imagined zones that we can now kind of revisit as they existed before the events that destroyed Draenor and turned it into Outland.
And stuff like Hellfire Peninsula is a jungle now, and Sangar Marsh is actually like an ocean.
Exactly. Zangar Marsh is the Zangar Sea, and you can see little, fungal growth and mushrooms and stuff along the shores that kind of hint at what would happen if those waters were drained, but that hasn't happened.
Right. So, dungeons. How many are you doing, and what can we sort of expect from them?
Sure. So, as always, we're going to have a bunch of awesome new dungeons and raid content. There are going to be 7 new dungeons that we're aiming to deliver on, 4 level-up dungeons, and these are going to span an array of settings across the entirety of the world of Draenor, ranging from the Blood Maw Ogre slag mines in Frostfire to the Shadowmoon burial mound beneath Shadowmoon Valley, where Ner'zhul is scheming and really working with the spirits of his ancestors in dark rituals that you need to put a stop to, taking on the Iron Horde directly, dealing with a demonic threat actually in the form of Gul'dan to Aukendun, and many more.
And on the raid side, what's going to be in the game when it launches?
Okay, so we're going to release with we're going to ship with 2 raid zones, very much mirroring this sort of the quantity and style of the content that we had for raids at the release of Mists of Pandaria. There'll be 2 raid zones, one 6-boss Ogre raid called Heimal in Nagrand, and a 10-boss Blackrock Foundry in Gorgrond, with the 6-boss raid being available immediately, and the 10-boss Foundry opening up a few weeks later to sort of provide players the ultimate initial challenge as they face off against Warlord Blackhand, who's the chieftain of the Blackrock Orcs.
Right. I know you guys are doing, you're expanding on the flex rate that you introduced in Pandaria, and you're also adding a new difficulty. Tell us about that and why.
Sure. So I think, expanding flex rate is something that we're really doing to bring the features and the advantages of flexible rating to many more players and to almost all players in our game. We're not necessarily so much adding a new difficulty as we are relabeling the existing ones that we have. Today we have this difficulty below normal that is called flexible, but going forward into Warlords doesn't really make sense to have a difficulty called flexible because that's just how almost all rating is going to be. So it really makes sense to call that normal. That is our new baseline. Right. But in terms of difficulty, in terms of tuning, it's going to be very similar to what you know as flexible today. Whereas the Warlords Heroic will be similar to what you know as normal today, and that leaves us needing to come up with a new name, which is therefore Mythic, which is parallel to the current Heroic.
And you've, believe Mythic will be tuned for 20 players instead of 25?
Yes. So what we realized as we had applied and extended the flexible model to all of our other modes, that the only place that a separate 10 and 25 division remained was at the highest end of hardcore rating. And we asked the question basically, what was the best thing for our design, what was the best thing for the game and our players in the long run? And we feel that by streamlining down to a single raid size for the hardest content, we can deliver better, more engaging, and better tuned, better designed encounters in the long run for those players.
And for those people who can't scrunch up 20 people, there's still flex mode available.
Well, I mean, yes, for some existing 10-player heroic guilds, they will indeed need to find a few additional players if they want to continue to participate in that level of content. In many cases, 2 10-player guilds may merge together. In other cases, one of the nice things about having a flexible structure for heroic is that it actually allows you to actually recruit and grow and continue raiding as you work your way up towards that size. Whereas today in Mists, for example, if a 10-player group wanted to try 25-player raiding, it was virtually impossible to cross that gap, because if you had 17 or 18 people, what could you do? You would still be doing 10-player raiding with a lot of people upset at sitting out of the raid and being on the bench. Whereas now, you can do 16-player heroic, 17-player heroic. Eventually, you get up to 20. Now you can start mythic. And this is going to be a new expansion. Often a lot of players returning to the game, a lot of players looking for raid guilds. We think that people who are looking to do that sort of hardcore raiding will be able to find and form these 20-player groups to do the content.
When I was playing the demo earlier, I noticed a lot of the numbers popping up on my screen have decreased, and the stats on items had decreased. Tell us about the changes you're making to the itemization there.
Yeah, so this is the grand item squish that we've talked about in a couple of contexts. We finally are going ahead and doing it. Ultimately, over the course of many expansions now, and exponential item growth at the end of each expansion, because every raid tier needs to be better than the last in terms of its gear, such that, even in Wrath of the Lich King, you had Nax, which went on to Ulduar, which went on to, Argent Coliseum, which went on to Icecrown Citadel. And that was maybe a 70 or 80% increase in player power. But now, actually, when you're just leveling up, you're just going from level 80 to 81. You don't need that huge jump randomly in power. So what we did was go back and kind of smooth those out, which has the effect of bringing the numbers back down to a somewhat more sane, comprehensible level. I mean, I've played this game since day one in vanilla, and I remember the first time I got to 1,000 spell power when I got a full set of vanilla Nax gear, and that was a really big benchmark for me. I remember roughly how much health and what my spell power was in Burning Crusade. I couldn't tell you today in Mists how much intellect I have. It's some 5-digit number. there's some value in keeping numbers comprehensible. The reality is also there's some technical limitations. Players who are doing heroic content in Siege of Orgrimmar may have noticed that some 25 heroic bosses actually have to heal a couple of times because there's effectively, at least currently the way our code works, a maximum health value the bosses can't cross. So if you fight Garrosh, there's a reason why Garrosh heals so many times. It's not just because we really like having bosses heal, it's because we needed to actually get a certain fight length without exceeding that cap. Now, of course, we could have fixed those technical problems. We may still fix those technical problems, but in the short term, we'd rather actually pour those resources into creating new content for our players rather than fixing technical issues like this, particularly since that we think that smaller numbers are going to be a better experience anyway. That said, this is all just about the numbers. The actual relative experience isn't going to change at all. When you log back on after the item squish is in effect and go to do whatever content you were doing, whether it's Siege of Orgrimmar Raid Finder, whether it's PvP, whether it's going back to solo an old raid like Tempest Keep to try to get your Ashes of Alar from Kael'thas, it's going to be completely unchanged. If a flash heal did 20% of your health before, it's going to do 20% after. If it took you 90 seconds to kill Kael'thas or Nixia or whatever before, it'll still take you 90 seconds after the squish. We're not trying to nerf players, we're just trying to make the numbers more comprehensible.
In a way, it's going back to the old school vanilla WoW thing where if you got an item with 12 stamina on it or something, that was a huge upgrade for you.
Potentially, yes. But I think in practice, the actual numbers for max level players that are fully geared are going to be more comparable to what you might remember from Wrath of the Lich King. I think players will probably have 30, 40,000 health, somewhere in that ballpark, and that's where we'll be. And the jumps in power from tier to tier are going to stay the same. Really, in relative terms, like if you mostly play with percentage display instead of absolute numbers, you probably wouldn't even know anything had changed.
One of the new features that's been, you were talking about at the panel yesterday, is the ability to boost one of your characters to level 90. Sort of like you were able to do with the Scroll of Resurrection, but now applied to everyone. How come?
I think ultimately we want people who are excited about Warlords of Draenor to be able to jump right into that new content and to facing off against the Iron Horde and just having that experience. I think a lot of us have had the experience where, we're trying to get a friend into the game or someone who hasn't played in a while, we want them to come back and check out the content and play with us, and they log back in, or maybe they log in for the first time, and the reality is maybe they were excited to see the new content, but they are a level 72 player in Borean Tundra, and in order to actually see Pandaria or to see Draenor or whatever it is that they want to see, they need to actually go through quite a bit of other stuff that isn't necessarily what they were excited to experience. And being able to play with your friends and get right into the action, I think, are incredibly important values to us, and we want to make sure that anyone who purchases Warlords of Draenor can, again, go right into and actually experience the content of Draenor.
Is there going to be a cap of where you can apply that boost? Like if you're over level 80, it won't work, or not?
No, I mean, technically, if you're level 90, well, then it won't work. But technically, you could apply it to a level 89 character. I don't know that I would recommend that, no. But you could do it.
Thanks a lot for talking to us, Ian.
No, my pleasure.
Our bond is iron. Our will unbreakable. Who will stand against us?